90 to 95% attrition rate. Let's talk about Russian Commandos. So I was sent this article by chat. I wanted to talk about this. I don't know all the facts to it, so we're going to be learning the facts together here. But the report I was told is that according to the leaked documents that were leaked by, Jax Textera, the airman who has been arrested for leaking hundreds of documents that covered far-reaching topics from the Indo-Pacific theater to China to our operations in the Middle East, and to what most of the focus has been on, the war in Ukraine, including Ukrainian air defense, which is a real risk to not only Ukrainian servicemen, but also civilians. It leaked data on our aid shipments. It leaked data on the troop training process and casualty numbers, on a lot of stuff. And one of the things that was leaked is that Russia's commando units, we're talking about the Spetsnaz, has been gutted. Absolutely gutted. We're talking about in the high 80s to 90s to not even, I think some of it even went up to 95%, some of the predictions of the Spetsnaz getting gutted, of Russia's special commandos. Let's read this article because that is an astonishing statistic. The war in Ukraine has gutted Russia's clandestine Spetsnaz forces, and it will take Moscow years to rebuild them, according to classified U.S. assessments obtained by the Washington Post. The finding, which has not been previously reported, is among a cache of sensitive materials leaked online through the messaging platform Discord. U.S. officials attributed their assessments to Russian commanders' over-reliance on specialized units, which have been put to use as a part of a frontline infantry formation. These formations, like the Ukrainians, have suffered massive numbers of dead and wounded. Typically, Spetsnaz personnel are assigned the sorts of stealthy, high-risk missions, according in apparent order to capture Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky. People forgot that earlier in the war. They were trying to capture Vladimir, and they've tried to assassinate him like a dozen times, for which they received some of Russia's most advanced military training. But when Moscow launched its full-scale invasion last year, senior commanders eager to seize momentum and skeptical of their conventional fighters' prowess deviated from the norm, ordering elite forces into direct combat, according to U.S. intelligence findings and independent analysts who have closely followed Spetsnaz deployments. The rapid depletion of Russia's commando units, observers say, shifted the war's dynamic from the outset, severely limited Moscow's ability to employ clandestine tactics in support of conventional combat operations. U.S. officials believe that the staggering casualties these units have sustained will render them less effective, not only in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world where Russian forces operates, according to the assessments, which range in data from late 2022 to earlier this year. Right here is one of the one of the satellite pieces of satellite. This is one of the satellite photos taken of Spetsnaz locations and how they have gotten more depleted over time. You can see on the left here, earlier in the war, Spetsnaz deployments prior to the invasion, and then afterwards. You can see the deterioration just between these two photos. Let's continue. The hollowing of these units appeared to be evident in the satellite imagery featured among the leaked materials. Before and after photos showing a base used by the 22nd Spetsnaz Special Brigade in southern Russia, according to the document, reveal that all but one of the 5 Russian separate Spetsnaz brigades that returned from combat operations in Ukraine in late summer of 2022 suffered significant losses. The slide includes 2 overhead images, one taken in November of 2021, months before the invasion began, and another captured a year later. The former shows a bustling motor pool teeming with vehicles. The later reveals what U.S. officials concluded is a state of extreme depletion months after the brigade's return home, with fewer than half of its Tigar tactical vehicles it had before the deployment. The 22nd and 2 other Spetsnaz brigades suffered from an estimated 90 to 95% attrition rate, the assessments say. Okay, so the number I had heard was not that the entirety of the Spetsnaz had suffered 90 to 95% attrition rates, is that 3 of the analyzed brigades that has been broken down by the Washington Post in these classified documents show 90 to 95% attrition rates, meaning that it's not 90 to 95% attrition rates as we saw the headlines pointing towards for the entirety of Spetsnaz. This is just a snapshot of the overall picture of the Spetsnaz, which indicates that they've taken very heavy losses, but this does not mean 95 to 90% for the entirety of the Spetsnaz. They're using this to show as a microcosm of the larger problem they've run into in using these Spetsnaz forces as frontline units. Compounding Russia's problems is the loss of experience within its elite forces. Spetsnaz soldiers require at least 4 years of specialized training, the U.S. documents say, concluding that it could take as long as a decade for Moscow to reconstitute these units. The documents do not say how many Spetsnaz troops are estimated to have been killed or wounded in Ukraine, but the materials, citing intelligence intercepts, assesses that one unit alone, the 346th, lost nearly the entire brigade with only 125 personnel active out of 900 deployed. U.S. intelligence analysts tracked every Spetsnaz unit that returned home to southern Russia from Ukraine, except for one, the 25th Spetsnaz Regiment. Several severe personnel and equipment losses, the documents say, could explain why there is no clear intelligence signature of their return to the garrison. So this would mean that they've basically been wiped out. The U.S. government assessments dovetail with analysts' observations. Rob Lee, a Russian military expert and senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, said that because Russia's motorized rifle infantry soldiers proved ineffective, commanders have sought to compensate by pushing elite airborne units, naval infantry, and Spetsnaz to the front, including in the failed bid to capture Ukraine's capital, Kiev, and for campaigns in the east and south. So what they're basically saying is, as Russia ran into problems during the march on Kiev and during the march on all these cities across the country, as they tried to basically topple the entire country in the first week or two of the war, they had ran into problems. Their logistics were garbage. The Ukrainians were fighting back, which seemed to be the main problem they ran into. They didn't really expect they'd get any resistance. They were running out of fuel, food, and their tactics were not that spectacular. A lot of times they would just walk in like a straight line towards major cities, getting ambushed and torn to shreds by anti-tank mines and ambushes along the way, and Bayraktar drones, which then created the Bayraktar memes and the songs around that from how much they were getting dunked on. So when they were running into these problems, these local Russian commanders made the determination like, we're losing, we're getting our butt kicked. Should we cut our losses? No. Let's double down, and if we deploy these really elite, amazing soldiers, just how cool they are and how awesome they are as these, like, you know, secret, like, super secretive and stealthy soldiers will overcome all their logistical, morale, and just strategic problems. Obviously, that did not work. When the VDV landed at Hostomel, they got battered and pushed back. When the Spetsnaz were introduced on the front line, whatever marginal improvement they gave the local commanders and the quality of their troops was not enough for them to take the city of Kiev, and eventually they had to withdraw. And so not only has Russia decimated its Spetsnaz forces and done it all for done it all in a way that I think a lot of Western generals and analysts would scratch their head at the idea of taking all these top tier soldiers and just throwing them into the meat grinder, but they've done it for very little benefit. They didn't take Kiev, they failed to take Kiev, and many of the locations they did use these Spetsnaz forces to fight in, locations across the country to capture, they've already lost and has already been liberated. And now they're dealing with the fact that a lot of these units have been wiped out to a point where they practically can't deploy them. And they have to wait years to retrain and get new people and grow the Spetsnaz to what it once was. And they probably will never see what the Spetsnaz as it once was during the entirety of this war, no matter how long it goes. There was an immediate consequence to that strategy. Russian commanders have burned through the best trained fighters, forfeited the valuable skills those troops possess, including intelligence gathering and reconnaissance from the start of the invasion through last fall. That affected the rest of the war because Russia lost all these key capabilities up front that they can't easily replace, both equipment-wise and talent-wise, he said. That affected what they could and couldn't do. Just days into the war, Spetsnaz troops arrived in the eastern city of Kharkiv in small numbers and without much support from the conventional troops. Many of them were killed or captured, he noted, and the Kharkiv counteroffensive, any territory they have captured, was pushed back upon with the recapturing of locations like Kupiansk. Several of their specialized vehicles were destroyed, videos and photos show. A similar situation played out in Mariupol in the south. By the way, I went to that location where they were trying to enter the city over and over and they kept getting beaten back. It is, when trying to enter Kharkiv from the Russian direction, there are these large fields, just fields and fields, just like long fields you can't see the end of. And there's like roads in the middle of these fields, just a few roads in the middle of these fields that you have to travel down. And this was during mud season. So what you had is a bunch of vehicles driving along these roads, and the Ukrainians basically just had to set themselves up at these roads and fire upon it because they pre-calculated the artillery. They would decimate the forces, they would pull back, and then they would try again the next day. Eventually, once the Russians had lost enough Spetsnaz troops and got tired of just banging their head against their wall to give themselves a concussion, they then just started shelling the city relentlessly, killing many civilians, and what essentially seemed like a revenge campaign. A similar situation played out in Mariupol in the south, Lee said, and in the eastern Donbass region, where fighting often took place in wooded areas where regular Russian motorized rifle units had difficulty operating. Spetsnaz forces have also operated in the coal mining town of Volodar in the Donetsk region. Volodar is also an example of this idea I just put forward, but it's an even more embarrassing example because there's a lot of footage of the Battle of Volodar. Can we actually look at Volodar footage? Because what we've seen is that they'll send in what they tried to do when they captured Volodar. I think it was Volodar. They tried to capture it recently. I think it was a month or maybe 2 months ago. And it was honestly embarrassing. They lost a ton of units and they got decimated. Let's watch a little segment on it before we finish the article. What we were seeing was Russian tanks. One would go forward, it would blow up on an explosive. Then the other tank would go around it and keep going and then blow up on another explosive, just going the exact same path because all of that area in front of Volodar has been heavily mined by Ukrainian sappers. Like the Ukrainian sappers I interviewed on my main channel, DylanBurnsTV, that you can go check out right now. 45 minutes, great interview, go check it out.
This satellite image shows a field outside the eastern Ukrainian town of Volodar, littered with destroyed tanks and infantry vehicles. Ukrainian and Western officials say this is the result of
coughing, my CIA handler, don't worry about it.
A battle which has already cost Russia dozens of military vehicles and hundreds of troops since February. The coal mining town in Ukraine became a new focus of Russia's offensive due to a strategic location. From here, Ukrainian forces can target rail lines linking Russian-occupied Donetsk to the Crimean Peninsula, a major base.
Okay, we know why it's important, but can we see the footage? Look at this.
In late February, Ukraine's army shared this video of an intersection just outside Volodar. Kiev says it shows a Russian armored vehicle running over a landmine. The area where at least 7 other vehicles appear to have been damaged.
They just kept going to the same spot and getting wiped out, man, just over and over and over again, man. Yeah, you can't say one thing, man. They don't give up.
Looks like what military experts call a choke point. As the video shows, Russian troops drove down a narrow route to the intersection, making them easy targets for mines and Ukrainian fire. Despite the obvious dangers, Russia...
Maybe the goal was to get so many destroyed pieces of Russian equipment at that intersection in Volodar that they basically make a wall of steel where then their soldiers can hide behind and be defended from like Ukrainian SPG-9 attacks and tanks.
Russian tanks seem to roll onto the same trap again and again, as we see in another video released a week later. Ukrainian soldiers on the front line say Russian forces kept making similar moves.
Постійно вони намагаються тут щось штурмувати. Якщо, не знаю, дивлячись, скільки вони людей своїх кладуть за одну якусь посадку, і скільки це часу.
They just said this reminds me of that tower defense game that upset me so much. We're just going back to the article. A soldier who served in Volodar with Ukraine's 72nd Mechanized Brigade told the Post that while he could not confirm his unit faced Spetsnaz, that was probably the case because they carried advanced body armor along with high-end night vision and thermal optics. Those enemy troops obtained in small units, this soldier said, conducting traditional reconnaissance and infantry missions. He spoke on the condition of anonymity, citing the sensitivity of recent operations. The apparent death of its Spetsnaz brigade commander in Volodar in February further illustrates the scope of the problem facing Russia, Lee said. If such a senior military leader is that far forward, there's probably something not quite right. It is crazy that it was that far forward. I remember earlier in the war, it was like dozens of Russian generals getting blown to shreds. And the reason why was because communication broke down. And during the advance on Kiev, the line got so long and the logistics were so poor and the communication so garbage that the generals literally had to go to the front to figure out why the line wasn't moving, like try to manage it. And the Ukrainians took advantage of this, ambushing where the generals were, killing them and going back. Or a lot of times it wouldn't even be, oh, we know where the generals are, we're going to go to where the generals are and kill them. It's that they would raid a position randomly near the front. They would go to a position randomly near the front, start wiping people out, and they just accidentally, or like not of their knowledge, end up killing generals. Either losses are too heavy in that unit, or they're being used in a way that they're not supposed to be. Russia's expenditure of its elite troops will have a cascading effect, the documents say, including a loss of some ability to train paramilitary groups and unconventional warfare tactics, which Russia has used to advance its interests abroad. Man, it's crazy that how much that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not only compromised Russia's ability to, attack Ukraine because of how much damage it's sustaining, and how, like, if they wanted to, once this war is over, if they wanted to invade Ukraine again in the future, they probably think twice, because they've hollowed out their own military. But this has limited their ability to prop up the Assad regime. It's limited their ability to come to the assistance of Armenia if Azerbaijan was to invade. And you can see how Azerbaijan is reacting to that, and how they're being more aggressive with Armenia, literally stopping civilians from evacuating in Nagorno-Karabakh when they're going through medical emergencies. It is compromising their ability to probably operate all throughout Africa, as the Wagner Group has done historically. And that's why the Wagner Group seems to be taking over a lot of those operations more, because it seems that the Spetsnaz, be a little compromised. Continuing. It's clear that Spetsnaz troops are a finite resource that can't be easily replenished, Lee said. What's not clear is whether conventional Russian commanders have learned from what's happened in Ukraine, or how best to use these elite forces. If they're still using them to attack in Volodar, then obviously they haven't learned. It's going to be a while before there is a full understanding of how they are adapting. There are signs online of the 22nd Separate Spetsnaz Brigade's activity in Ukraine. One video from last summer appears to show members of the unit's sniper section moving through buildings, using high-end equipment out of reach for many Russian regulars. Other images lack the same bravado. Photos purporting to show a young captain in the 22nd, Alexei, circulated in March 2022, along with images of a granite memorial to soldiers killed before the war, was even 2 months old. Alexei's name is described at the top. Man, the Spetsnaz has lost its glory. The VDV was humiliated at Hostomel, and they've been suffering extreme losses. The Spetsnaz has been suffering extreme losses. Many of their brigades suffering 90 to 95% attrition rates. Man, the bravado of the Russian elite forces, that propaganda image has been built up for years, has been completely torn down and tarnished. And it's all the fault of Russia's own incompetence.